I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Today we're reading from the book of Leviticus, chapter 12. Now let's focus on verse 16. When her days of purification are complete, whether a son or a daughter, she is to bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a year-old male lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. Leviticus 12, verse 6. So chapter 11 had been a reminder of our fallen world and of man's dealings with it. It described a world of clean and unclean, a world in which many of its parts must be shunned because they're not clean. But don't forget that it is also a world in which many of its parts are wholesome and good for men. Man can avoid the unclean and be holy, set apart to God. And to some extent, men can be like him. Provision had been allowed by God to counter the effect of the fall as far as mankind was concerned. Now here in chapter 12 comes a reminder of another consequence of the fall, how the fall affected women. Childbirth was now inevitably connected with uncleanness. It is through the discomforts of childbirth that God chooses to remind women of Eve's part in the fall. We find that in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. And it stands as a reminder that every time a child is born, another sinner is born into a sinful world. So in every case of childbirth, there was no avoiding uncleanness. It was not a question of choice. It was something that had to be endured. Birth inevitably involved sin because the birth process had been affected by sin. The child being born into the world was now subject to sin. Indeed, he or she was born a sinner by nature. Therefore, the very process of birth falls short of perfection and must be deemed unclean. And that's why the woman, being in the process of producing a sinner, was prevented from approaching the holiness of God. She had to be purified along with the child. And any person observing or participating in the birth of a child can see God's point quite clearly. When a child is born, it's covered with blood and mucus. It comes out unclean. And this does not contradict the Luke chapter 2, verse 23 statement that every child who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. The latter verse communicates that the first newborn child is seen as set apart for the Lord's service, not that it's ritually holy at the point of birth. Now, in the grace and the mercy of God, while it enters the world unclean, the firstborn is also set apart as His. He is the Lord's. And because of the grace of God, it was recognized that the uncleanness of a woman during childbirth would be temporary and not permanent. Therefore, through following God's word, the woman and the child could come out of their period of uncleanness in childbearing and then return to cleanness in the light of God's holiness, with all traces of sin being put behind them. And that is the process described in today's passage. It's also a picture of salvation through Jesus and the necessity of us being born again, made clean through Jesus Christ. I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Check us out at groundworksministries.com.